During the Second World War, millions lived without electricity, refrigeration, or supply chains. But they didn't starve. They didn't wait for aid. They relied on food that didn't need freezing, food that didn't expire. Across occupied villages, burnt cities, and isolated farms, families preserved what they could and buried what they couldn't afford to lose. Jars of beans were sealed with wax, meat was smoked, dried, or packed in ash. Vegetables were fermented, salted, and lowered into cold earth. These weren't backup plans. They were the plan. Modern prepping often means shelves filled with packaging, expiration dates, and vacuum seals. But in 1942, there was no vacuum, no plastic, no second chance. The foods that lasted were chosen because they always had, because they worked before electricity and long after it failed. Families who survived didn't store food in panic. They stored it in silence, season after season, knowing what vanished once might not return. No labels, no guarantees, just calories, guarded like gold. These are 15 foods WWII families stockpiled. They never expired, and many are still keeping people alive in places where the lights never came back. Number 1. Brined root vegetables. In the harsh winters of Eastern Europe, food didn't rot because it was saved before it had the chance. Root vegetables, carrots, beets, turnips, were pulled from the soil before frost, washed clean, and lowered into jars filled with salt, vinegar, and boiled water. Not to flavor, to survive. Without refrigeration, families used centuries-old brining methods. The acid from vinegar and the absence of oxygen slowed bacteria to a crawl. These jars were sealed in silence, stacked in root cellars, or buried in crates beneath wooden barns. There were no expiration dates. There was no margin for error. If the jars were spoiled, winter would win. Civilians in Poland and Hungary relied on this method every year of the war. The vegetables remained edible for months, even years if left unopened. Some households lined shelves with 40 or 50 jars, each filled during the last days of autumn. It wasn't just food, it was insurance against hunger, ration lines, and whatever the front line brought next. Brining didn't need power, it didn't need packaging. It needed only salt, heat, and memory. This wasn't just survival, it was memory passed down in silence. Number 2. Smoke-dried meat. In forests behind the Eastern Front, smoke meant two things: danger or food. When livestock had to be slaughtered before retreat, or when wild game was caught in remote villages, families turned meat into something that wouldn't vanish overnight. They dried it in smokehouses over low-burning fires, sometimes for days. Not for flavor, for preservation. Beef, venison, and rabbit were sliced thin, rubbed with salt, and hung on wooden racks above smoldering hardwood. Smoke dried the flesh and coated it with antibacterial compounds, while the salt pulled out moisture that would otherwise rot it from within. No refrigeration, no cans, just instinct and ember. In Slovakia, entire communities prepared meat this way before winter or occupation. The dried strips were wrapped in cloth or wax paper, stored in clay pots, or tied in bundles and hidden in rafters. It could last a year, sometimes longer. Even retreating soldiers knew the value. A pouch of dried meat could mean the difference between movement or collapse. But for civilians, it meant something deeper. Protein in a world of porridge, strength where there was none. Smoke-dried meat wasn't convenient. It was sacred. Every strip was survival condensed. One forgotten skill, one more day alive. Number 3. Fermented cabbage. In the sieged cities of Eastern Europe, fresh food disappeared within days. But in the dark corners of basements and the backs of broken kitchens, one thing held its ground: cabbage, submerged in its own sour resilience. Families turned to fermentation not because they liked the taste, but because it worked. They shredded cabbage, packed it with salt, and pressed it under heavy stones inside wooden barrels or clay crocks. There was no vinegar, just time. Natural lacto-fermentation transformed it. The bacteria that ruined food were replaced by bacteria that preserved it. In Berlin, during the final years of war, sauerkraut was more common than bread. A barrel filled in October could feed a family until March. The process required no heat, no electricity, and no materials other than patience, salt, and something to weigh it down. When done right, the result could last a year or more, retaining vitamin C, adding gut-stabilizing probiotics, and requiring no flame to consume. It didn't just feed bodies, it stabilized them. In environments where infection and malnutrition were constant threats, fermented cabbage became more than food. It became medicine. And though it was sour, pungent, and often eaten cold in silence, it was dependable, which made it priceless. Tech fails. But this method never did. Number 4. Sundried vegetables. In the summer of 1941, the sun in rural Italy wasn't just a source of warmth, it was preservation. With no refrigeration and no promise of returning harvests, villagers laid out their vegetables on rooftops, wooden planks, and wire mesh. Tomatoes, peppers, onions, sliced thin, salted lightly, and left beneath the open sky. Drying vegetables wasn't a backup plan, it was the main defense against winter starvation. The sun, combined with wind and time, pulled moisture from the flesh without destroying nutrients. What remained was light, compact, and durable, vegetables that could survive months without spoilage. In Serbia and Greece, families often strung vegetables on thread and hung them in attics or near chimneys where airflow was steady and dry. A kilo of tomatoes could shrink to a handful of brittle strips, but in soup or stew, it returned with warmth and flavor. Stored in linen sacks or small wooden boxes, these dried fragments became precious additions to meals when the fields were frozen and the markets were gone. It didn't require chemicals. It didn't require fuel. Just sun, air, and a place to wait. In a world that spoiled quickly, dried vegetables offered something rare, time preserved in slices. This wasn't convenient. This was a necessity wrapped in dust and silence. Number 5. Herbs and medicinal spices. When medical supplies vanished and store shelves emptied, families turned to their kitchens. Not for flavor, but for defense. Spices weren't luxuries during the war. They were frontline medicine, preservation agents, and morale lifters, all sealed in tiny cloth pouches and glass jars. Salt was the most essential. Used to cure meat, preserve vegetables, and clean wounds, it didn't just make food last longer, it kept people alive longer. In many parts of rural France, salt was bartered like currency, stored in barrels away from moisture, guarded like grain. Black pepper was crushed and added to soup not just for taste, but to ease digestion. Cinnamon and clove were steeped in boiling water to soothe sore throats and chest infections. Thyme, dried in bunches above kitchen hearths, was used in tea to fight fever. In villages where antibiotics were out of reach, dried herbs became the last line of defense. Even when food was bland, these spices gave a meal its dignity. And when sickness spread, they gave a sense of control. Most importantly, they stored well. Wrapped in cloth, sealed in tins or pressed into bricks, many herbs retained their potency for years, some indefinitely. In occupied zones where silence was survival, a pinch of spice meant warmth, a trace of normal, a memory of before. It's a method modern prepping still hasn't reclaimed. Number 6. Wined dried fruits. In the quiet hills of occupied Czechoslovakia, fruit didn't rot, it waited. Apples, pears, and plums were sliced thin, laid on wooden trays, and dried by wind and sun. No sugar, no preservatives, just nature's patience, captured in every shriveled piece. Families would collect fruit at the end of harvest, when trees gave everything before the frost. Slices were arranged carefully, turned often, and brought indoors each night to avoid dew. The goal wasn't sweetness, it was survival. As moisture disappeared, nutrients stayed. What remained could last for years. Dried fruit was never the main course. It was rationed like medicine, chewed slowly during fever, soaked in warm water to flavor porridge, or hidden in coat pockets for children who hadn't seen candy in months. In some villages, dried apricots were used in barter, more valuable than coins. Stored in cloth sacks or sealed inside reused jars, these fruits stayed edible through snow, retreat, and even displacement. They didn't melt. They didn't spoil. They were light, portable, and needed no fire to consume. In times when sugar was scarce and morale was lower, even one sliver of apple could offer energy and hope. This wasn't about taste, it was about endurance wrapped in sweetness. A small fruit carrying a season's memory into a starving winter. One forgotten skill, one more day alive. Number 7. Dried grain pasta. In the bombed-out kitchens of post-invasion Italy, flour was not wasted. It was shaped into survival. Pasta wasn't just tradition. It was a food that could wait. Rolled, cut, and air-dried on wooden boards, homemade noodles became one of the few storable foods that didn't rot, didn't spoil, and needed only boiling water to bring them back. Without access to refrigeration or canned meals, families across southern Europe made pasta by hand, often with nothing more than flour, salt, and a bit of water or egg when available. Shapes didn't matter. Longevity did. Once dried fully, and stored in linen bags or tin boxes, it could last years. Some villages in war-torn zones gathered for communal pasta-making days, spreading sheets on rooftops, using the sun to do what no machine could. It wasn't convenient food, it was a calculated use of grain. When other food sources disappeared, pasta became the base, mixed with wild herbs, lard, or scraps of dried vegetables. A bowl could stretch small ingredients into a filling meal. Stored dry and protected from moisture, these handmade noodles were among the most reliable forms of calories available through long periods of scarcity. In every strand, there was strategy. In every sack, survival. This wasn't just survival, it was memory, passed down in silence. Number 8. Powdered milk. In the silent mornings of post-Blitz London, when fresh milk stopped arriving, families opened tins filled with pale dust. Powdered milk, dry, lifeless, yet vital, became the only way to preserve what cattle could no longer provide. Unlike fresh dairy, which is spoiled within days without refrigeration, powdered milk could last for years. It was made by evaporating liquid milk into a concentrated powder, removing water but leaving behind calcium, protein, and the faint comfort of normalcy. During the war, shipments of powdered milk arrived in ration boxes, but many rural families made their own, scalding fresh milk, then drying it in pans over warm stoves or fire-heated bricks. Once dry, the flakes were crushed and stored in glass jars, sometimes wrapped in cloth to keep out air and light. It wasn't a luxury. It was nutrition, used in bread dough, stirred into tea, or reconstituted to feed infants when nothing else could. For families forced underground or displaced across borders, powdered milk weighed little, needed no fire, and carried vital calories across days without food. Even decades later, tins have been opened and found still safe, unchanged by time. It wasn't fresh, but it was reliable. And in times of crisis, reliability is what keeps people standing. It's a method modern prepping still hasn't reclaimed. Number 9. Tinned garden harvests. In the countryside of wartime Ukraine and across bombed-out farms in Belgium, fresh harvests didn't go to waste. They went into jars: green beans, peas, tomatoes, corn, boiled, sealed, and hidden from soldiers, rats, and time itself. Before the war, home canning was already a seasonal rhythm. But during occupation and scarcity, it became an act of resistance. Families worked quickly after harvest, washing and cutting vegetables, packing them tightly into glass jars, and pouring in salted water or their own brine. Then came the boil, an open fire or stove heating the sealed jars until the vacuum formed and death couldn't get in. These were not industrial cans. They were reused jars with melted wax or metal lids, stored beneath floorboards behind false walls, or in cellars dug by hand. In some villages, entire pantries disappeared underground to avoid confiscation. Canning wasn't just preservation, it was strategy. A single summer could produce 50 to 100 jars, each one capable of feeding a family for days when supply lines collapsed or winter closed in. The process required patience, timing, and a deep understanding of spoilage and heat. The reward? Vegetables that tasted like summer. Even in February? For the elderly and the young, a spoonful of canned peas meant nutrition. For the rest, it meant proof that the land hadn't given up. And the truth is, canned properly, these jars lasted 10 to 20 years, long after the war ended. There was no plan B, only adaptation. Number 10. Salt bricks and broth stones. In the ruins of Warsaw and the mountain huts of Slovakia, meals weren't always warm, but they were never tasteless. When meat was scarce and vegetables were plain, flavor came in the form of small, concentrated treasures, salt bricks and broth cubes. These weren't luxuries. They were the final defense against food fatigue, when the body had calories but the soul had none. The Amish and war-era families alike kept bouillon cubes and dried broth stored like medicine. Just one cube, dropped into boiling water, could turn plain rice into something close to comfort. Salt, ground and pressed into bricks, or packed in jars, served more than just flavor. It preserved meat, cured vegetables, cleaned wounds, and even killed parasites in water. In farmhouses without refrigeration, salt-lined barrels kept pork from rotting, sometimes for an entire year. Bouillon was often made at home, boiled down from bones, herbs, and salt until it became thick, then dried on cloth or stone slabs and cut into chunks. Each piece is stored in wax paper or glass, ready to rehydrate when needed. These compact blocks of nourishment could sit on shelves for 5 years, sometimes more if kept dry. They didn't fill my stomach, but they changed the meal. And in war, that was often enough. Flavor wasn't a luxury. It was survival, dissolved one cube at a time, one forgotten skill, one more day alive. Number 11. Rolled oats and cracked grains. In the bitter mornings of post-war Austria, when fires burned low and bread was a memory, families stirred something humble into boiling water. Oats. Not because it tasted good, because it never fails. Rolled oats, barley, and cracked wheat were among the few grains that could survive without refrigeration, packaging, or preservatives. Stored in sacks, glass jars, or tin bins, these grains absorbed no moisture, attracted no rot, and waited in silence, sometimes for years. In the German countryside, oats were often bought or bartered by weight, then hidden in attics or buried in crates beneath cellar floors. A single 50-pound sack could last a family of 4 for months. They were boiled into porridge, added to stews, or ground into flour when wheat ran out. And unlike bread, they needed no oven, just heat and patience. Nutritionally, oats gave more than comfort. They delivered fiber, iron, and slow-burning energy during times when sugar was rare and meat was rationed. Cracked wheat provided bulk to thin soups. Barley gave body to bone broths. These grains didn't expire. They sustained, and they were quiet. No odor, no sound, just weight in the corner of a room, holding up an entire winter's worth of meals. This wasn't breakfast. It was ballast for the body. And for many, the only thing that filled the silence. Tech fails, but this method never did. Number 12. White vinegar. In farmsteads blacked out by war and cut off from supply lines, there was one liquid more valuable than oil, white vinegar. Not for drinking, not for trade, but because it did everything else. Vinegar wasn't just poured on food, it preserved it. In rural Romania and across occupied France, families stored gallons of homemade vinegar to pickle vegetables, disinfect wounds, clean tools, and even repel insects. It became one of the most versatile tools in a household with no electricity, no running water, and no backup. Its power came from acetic acid, strong enough to stop bacterial growth in jars, scrub mold from wooden floors, and extend the shelf life of almost anything it touched. Vinegar wasn't just clean, it was protected. Old-timers would ferment it themselves, using leftover wine, cider, or souring fruit. Stored in clay jugs or reused glass bottles, it never expired. Some villages passed down starter cultures, feeding them like sourdough, to ensure vinegar would always be there, even if everything else failed. It was poured over cabbage, mixed into flour, and splashed on cuts. It didn't need cold, it didn't need labels. It simply worked. And when even soap was gone, vinegar was enough. This wasn't convenient. This was a necessity wrapped in dust and silence. Number 13, stone-milled cornmeal. In the southern U.S. and scattered farming communities of Europe, when flour disappeared and mills fell silent, there was still one food people could make with nothing but a grindstone and fire: cornmeal. Families dried whole corn kernels by the sack, spread under the sun or by the hearth. Once hardened, they ground it between stones, slowly, carefully, until it became a coarse golden meal. This wasn't luxury baking. This was survival fuel. In rural wartime Appalachia, cornmeal was stored in linen sacks, tied tight, and hung from ceiling beams to keep pests away. Across Eastern Europe, similar traditions endured, with families sealing it in clay pots or burying it in cool, dry trenches. Its value wasn't just in nutrition, it was in durability. When kept away from moisture, it could last years. Cornmeal could be cooked into porridge, baked into ash cakes on flat stones, or fried into dense patties. No yeast, no rising, just water, fire, and a handful of grain. Its high calorie content made it one of the most efficient survival foods. And unlike white flour, it didn't spoil quickly or mold easily. People didn't rely on cornmeal because it was delicious. They relied on it because it never left them hungry. Every handful was ground by hand. Every loaf was earned. It's a method modern prepping still hasn't reclaimed. Number 14, clay-sealed cold storage. Before electricity rewired the modern kitchen, cold came from earth. Not ice, not machines, just depth, shade, and sealed clay. In parts of Germany, Serbia, and rural Ukraine, families stored perishables in zier pots or buried clay vessels, primitive refrigerators that needed nothing but wisdom. These double pot systems used evaporative cooling. A smaller clay pot was placed inside a larger one, the gap between them filled with wet sand. When the outer pot's surface evaporated the water, it drew heat out from the inner pot. Inside, food stayed cool, sometimes by more than 20 degrees, without a single wire or flame. This method wasn't theory, it was daily use. Villagers stored milk, butter, even cheese wrapped in leaves or soaked cloth. During summer, they rotated pots under shade trees, keeping the sand moist with well water. In winter, pots were sometimes buried in ash or hay inside root cellars, where insulation slowed spoilage to a crawl. The genius lay in materials: clay, sand, water. Available to everyone, expensive to no one. Families who mastered this kept eggs unspoiled for weeks, greens crisp longer, and dairy usable without risk. In war-torn areas where power lines were gone and modern storage was a memory, clay offered continuity. No noise, no failure, just a centuries-old design that outlasted bombs and blackouts. This wasn't technology, it was patience, molded into permanence. Number 15, Ashcured root vegetables. In war-ravaged Finland and across the Baltic countryside, winters didn't just freeze crops, they erased access. Roads were snowed in and markets destroyed. So families preserved their harvest in the one substance always available: ash. After every cooking fire, ashes were swept into barrels or pits, not discarded. They were dry, alkaline, and insect repellent, perfect for hiding food. Root vegetables like carrots, beets, and parsnips were packed in layers: vegetable ash, until the container was full. It was then sealed with cloth, stored in a dry corner of the barn, shed, or even under the floorboards. This wasn't a guess. It was generations of observation. Ash created an oxygen-poor, pest-resistant environment. It absorbed moisture, neutralized acidity, and deterred rodents. A properly ash-cured carrot could last 6 months. A beet? Even longer. In Latvia, some families hid their ash barrels in cellars beneath hay to avoid confiscation. Others disguised them as firewood bins when soldiers passed through. The technique preserved food silently, without salt, without refrigeration, and without notice. What emerged in midwinter wasn't fresh, but it was firm, edible, and nourishing. A carrot baked in stew, a beet grated into broth, flavors from a past season, surviving where everything else had crumbled. Ash did more than preserve. It protected memory. A way of making harvests last just a little longer, of not starting from zero when spring returned. Every layer was an act of defiance against decay, one forgotten skill, one more day alive. Now you understand. Survival wasn't about canned goods or convenience. It was about rhythm, soil, fire, silence. The people who endured the collapse of systems didn't have gadgets or guides. They had memories, and memory was enough. From ash to vinegar, from dried grains to jars sealed with wax, these weren't trends. They were lifelines. Each method carried a story, passed from hand to hand, not to be clever, but to stay alive. They didn't prepare out of fear. They prepared because it was the only way forward. What we've forgotten, they lived daily. No electricity, no fallback, just skill, repetition, and an unbreakable relationship with their land. You've just seen 15 methods that don't need a generator or the grid. They only need you to relearn, to rebuild, to remember. Because in every war, every famine, and every blackout, it was always these quiet techniques that endured. And they still will. Want more lost wisdom like this? Hit like and subscribe. We're just getting started. One subscription helps revive the knowledge they died to preserve.